Hello, greetings, and welcome. I'm Brien Posey, and in this video, I want to show you some techniques for working with the grid in the Windows presentation framework using PowerShell. So one of the things that's somewhat unique about the Windows presentation framework is that when you arrange GUI objects on the screen or within a window, you do it using a grid. So in other words, we create a series of rows and columns, kind of like a spreadsheet, and then we insert GUI objects within those, I'll call them cells, in that grid that we've created. So let's take a look at how this works. What I've got here is a very simple PowerShell script that creates a 3x3 grid. So let's step through this really quickly. So initially what I'm doing is I'm adding in the presentation framework assembly. You can see I've got add type, assembly name, presentation framework. Then I define the Windows presentation framework window, and I do that by setting up a variable called $window and setting that equal to new object of type system.windows.window. Then I set the window width and height. So the next thing that we do is we create the grid. And I've created a variable called $grid, and I've set that variable equal to a new object of type system.windows.control.grid. So from there, we begin creating rows and columns. So in this particular script, I'm creating the rows first, and you can see that I'm referencing the $grid variable that I just created. And then I've got .rowDefinitions.add, so I'm adding a row definition. And then that row definition is going to be new object of type system.windows.control.rowDefinition. And I'm repeating this line of code 3 times so that I can create 3 separate rows within this grid. And creating columns works exactly the same way. So down here, I'm creating 3 columns in this block of code right here. So you can see I've got $grid, that's the variable corresponding to my grid, and then .columnDefinitions.add, so I'm adding a column definition. And for that column definition, I've got new object of type system.windows.controls.columnDefinition. Now, one thing that I want to point out before I move on is that in this particular script, each row is being done in a single line of code, and each column is being done in a single line of code. So here I'm creating a row, here I'm creating a row, here I'm creating a row. And each one of these actually is one line. It's just wrapped because of the length of the line and the size of my window. And then here I'm creating a column, here I'm creating a column, and here I'm creating a column. Now the reason why I wanted to point that out is because I've got a few more scripts that I want to show you in this video. And in some of those scripts, I'm going to be breaking out the row definition into multiple lines just to make it a little bit easier to follow what I'm going to be doing. But I did want to make a point of pointing out that in this particular case, I'm creating each row in a single line, and I'm creating each column in a single line. So with that said, let's go ahead and move on. So the next thing that I need to do is create a label. And a label is just a mechanism that we're using to display text on the screen. And in this case, we've just got a block of text that says, "Hello World." So I'm creating a label right here, and that's a new object of type system.windows.controls.label. And then I'm defining the label content, which is the words "Hello World." And then I'm adding the label to the grid. And we're doing that with these 2 lines right here. So the first thing that we have to do is specify the row that that label is going to go in. So for this particular row definition, I'm inserting $label, that's the name of our label, and I'm putting in row 0. Now row 0 is always going to be the first row, so this is going to be the row at the top of the grid. And then I'm doing the same thing with the columns. So set column, what do I want in that column? $label. And then which column do I want? Column 0. So that's going to be the leftmost column. So then the last things that I have to do is add the grid to the window and then display the window. So let's take a look at what this looks like when I run the script. So here's what the output looks like. We've created a label containing the words "Hello World," and we've put that label in row 0, column 0, which is the upper left corner of the grid. So you can see that right here. Now, what if we wanted to move this label elsewhere? Well, that's easy enough to do. Let me go ahead and close this out. And let's put this in row 1, column 1. So I'll change this to row 1. And I'll change this to column 1. Let me save my changes. And we'll go ahead and run the script. And so now you can see that our label has moved. So that's just the basics of adding a label to a grid. So now that I've shown you the basics, I want to show you some ways that you can manipulate this. Let me go ahead and close this out. And I want to show you another script that I've created just for the sake of illustration. I'm not going to go through all of the code on this one because I'm going to be covering the highlights with two other scripts that I've got. But let me just show you this script. This one is grid2.ps1. I'll go ahead and run it. And so what I've got here is just a window that illustrates the various positions within the grid. Now the window size is a little bit smaller than what we had a second ago, but the script works in essentially the same thing. The only thing that I'm doing different is that I've created multiple labels just so that you can see the various positions. Now remember, I said that row 0 was the very first row at the top of the grid, and that column 0 was the very first column at the leftmost portion of the grid. So here we have row 0, column 0, row 0, column 1, row 0, column 2, and then beneath that we have row 1, column 0, row 1, column 1, row 1, column 2, and so on and so forth. Now, if you think back to that script that I just showed you, we initially placed the label at row 0, column 0, and the text appeared in the upper left portion of the window. So you can see right here, row 0, column 0 is right here, and that's about where our text appeared. Then I made a change, and I changed the script so that it would display the label in row 1, column 1. And if you look right here, row 1, column 1 is right here in the center. So that's why we saw that text label move. So I just wanted to give you a better feel for the positions within the grid. Let me go ahead and close this out, and I've got another script that I want to show you. So here we have another script that we can use to play around with row sizes, because sometimes you may want to have a little bit more control over the size of your rows based on the types of objects that you're going to be placing in those rows. So I've got a few different methods that I'm going to be using to control the row sizes. So before I step you through what I'm doing right here, let me go ahead and run the script so that I can have the output on screen. So here's what the output looks like. And immediately you can see that I've added some color to each one of the rows, but you'll also notice that the rows are now of different sizes. So let me show you first how I added the color. I don't want to go too much into coloring because that's kind of beyond the scope of this video, but I at least want to show you how I did it. So let me scroll down. And right here you can see that I've got a section, add a rectangle to act as a background for row 0. Remember, row 0 is going to be the top row, so that's that pink row right here. So what I've done is I set up a variable called $rectangle, and I set that equal to new object of type system.windows.shapes.rectangle. So I'm creating a rectangle object. Then I said $rectangle.fill, and I set the color equal to pink. Then I had to specify where I wanted that rectangle to appear. So we have system.windows.control.grid, and then set row, and then I'm placing the rectangle on row 0. Now we also have to specify a column, and I needed this particular rectangle to span the entire width of the window, and that window is made up of 3 columns. So the way that I did that was I just duplicated the rectangle in each one of the columns. So here you can see set column span $rectangle 1, and then 2, and then 3. So I'm placing the rectangle in all 3 of my columns. And then the last thing that I did was I just added that rectangle to the grid. So that's how I handled the different colors that you see in the output. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's go back to the subject at hand. And that subject is, how do I control the size of the rows? Now it's worth noting that for the purposes of this video, I'm only focusing on row sizes, but you can do exactly the same thing for column sizes, and that's handled in exactly the same way as what I'm about to show you. I'm just focusing on rows for the sake of simplicity. So let me go ahead and scroll up. Now, as you'll recall, when I showed you my very first script, I mentioned that I was defining rows on a single line of code, and that later on I was going to be breaking that out into multiple lines of code, and that's what I've done here. So let's take a look at row 0. So here we have row 0, and here's where I'm creating the row definition, and then here's the line that adds the row to the grid. But between those two lines, I've got a line of code that sets the row height, and you'll notice the row height is set to 50. So that's 50 pixels. So if you look at the pink row in my output, this is 50 pixels high. So if you need to create a row of a very specific size, that's how you would go about doing it. Now, I'm doing something a little bit different for the green and the blue rows. So if you take a look, here we have row 1 that we're defining, and I set the row definition up in exactly the same way, and I add the row to the grid in exactly the same way. And the same could also be said for the next row after that. Here I have row 2, and I'm setting up the row definition, and I'm adding that row to the grid. But take a look at what I did for row height. Here I have row height equals 1 asterisk. And then beneath that, I have row.height equals 2 asterisk. So this is a dynamic way of defining rows, and the row sizes are relative to one another. So essentially what I've got going is that if you use 2 asterisk, then the row is going to get twice as much space as if you had used 1 asterisk. So if you look right here, you can see the size of the green row, and this was generated dynamically based on the size of the window. So this is a unit of 1, for lack of a better word. Now in the blue, we told it to use 2 units instead of just 1. So the blue section is going to be twice the size of the green section. Now, if I scroll down a little bit more in my script, we've got one more row down here at the bottom, and that's our gray row. And for the gray row, I just set the row height to auto. And so what that does is it creates a row whose height is based on the object that we're inserting into the row. So the object that I inserted was just a text label, and you'll notice that the row is sized perfectly based on the size of that text label. So that's how you go about adjusting row height. And as I said earlier, column height works in exactly the same way. The only difference is that you apply the height to the column definition as opposed to the row definition. So let me go ahead and close this out, and I've got one more script that I want to show you. So in this case, you'll notice that we have a blue rectangle in the middle of the screen, and we have the words "Hello World" that appear in the upper left portion of the rectangle. The reason why I wanted to create this script is to show you how you can place an object within a cell in the grid with a bit more precision. Because let's take a look at what we're doing here. Once again, we have a 3x3 grid that we're creating. So here's the grid definition, and this is exactly like what I showed you in the initial script. We have one line of code for each row and one line of code for each column. So I'm creating a row here, I'm creating a row here, I'm creating a row here, and then I'm creating a column here, and then a second column here, and then a third column right here. So we have a 3x3 grid, 3 rows, 3 columns. So then the next thing that I did was I created a colored rectangle. And this time, instead of spanning the entire width of the grid, I simply created one rectangle and I placed it in a single cell. So I placed that rectangle in row 1, column 1. Remember, row 0 is the top row. So row 1 is the row beneath that. And then column 0 is the leftmost column. So column 1 is the column that's just to the right of that. So this is the middle cell on my grid, and you can see that this rectangle does indeed appear in the middle. Now let's go down to where my label is being created. So you can see that right here. Now in the case of my label, I'm placing that label in row 1 and I'm placing the label in column 1. So the label appears in the exact same cell as the rectangle, but you'll notice that the label appears in the upper left corner of this rectangle. So even though we're telling PowerShell that we want this label to appear in the center cell within our grid, the label itself appears in the upper left corner of that cell. So we're not exactly centering the text here. But what could we do if we needed that text to be centered on the screen? Well, this is where the concept of margins come into play. Margins don't just apply to labels, they apply to just about any GUI object that you create using WPF. So what the margin does is it controls the position of that element within a cell in our grid. So I want to show you a few examples of this. Right now we don't have a margin set up at all, and the end result is that the label is added to the upper left portion of the cell that we've designated, just as you see here. I'm going to go ahead and remove the comment symbol for this line of code. So here we have label.margin equals 50. So that 50 represents 50 pixels. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us a margin of 50 pixels all around that label. Now, if you take a look at the label right here, again, it's in the upper left corner of this particular cell. So pay attention to the positioning of the words "Hello World." Let me go ahead and close this out, and I'll save my changes, and let me rerun the script. And so now you can see that my label has indeed moved based on that margin that I've set up. So we have a buffer of 50 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the left. Now technically there's also a buffer of 50 pixels from the right and from the bottom, but because of the size of our label, those aren't really coming into play. So with that said, let me go ahead and close this out. And let's take a look at another way to define a margin. So I'm going to go ahead and add that comment symbol back in. And if you look at the next line of code, you can see that we have a label margin of 20, 10, 30, 5. So this is what's known as a custom margin. And incidentally, these numbers are just random numbers that I picked off the top of my head. What that translates to is a margin of 20 from the left, 10 from the top, 30 from the right, and 5 from the bottom. So let me go ahead and get rid of the comment symbol, and I'll save my changes and I'll show you what this looks like. So here we have a margin of 20 pixels from the left of the cell, which you can see right here where my mouse pointer is, 10 pixels from the top of the cell, and then 30 pixels from the right of the cell, and 5 pixels from the bottom of the cell. So that's how you define a custom margin. Let me go ahead and close this out, and there's one more margin type that I want to show you. So I'll add the comment symbol back in. And the last thing that I want to show you is a variation of the technique that I just showed you, because you can control margins purely horizontally or purely vertically. So let me go ahead and remove this comment symbol. And this line of code looks exactly like the one that I just showed you, except that you'll notice that we have a left and a right margin of 70, and then we have a top and bottom margin of 0. So what this is going to do is this is going to force the label to appear at the top of the cell, but we're going to have a buffer of 70 pixels on each side. So let me go ahead and save this, and let's rerun the script. And so now we can see that the Hello World label is back to being at the very top of the cell, but we have a 70 pixel buffer on the left and on the right. So those are some techniques that you can use to play around with placement of an object inside a cell within a grid. I'm Brien Posey. Thanks for watching.